Welcome back to iZotope RX5 video series on voice editing. Today we'll be looking at Dialog Denoise. Keep an eye out for the instructions for the chance to win a copy of iZotope RX plugin bundle. There's also a grand prize of RX to be won. There are two Denoise VST plugins, Spectral Denoise and Dialog Denoise. These two plugins are actually part of the same Denoise module inside RX5 standalone, but are presented as separate in the VST version. A quick recap of my setup. I usually have 4 tracks in my editing session, 1 track for the main text recording, and 2 tracks for specific audio processing. These 3 tracks are then routed to a subgroup track that holds most of the processing plugins. I tend to use Dialog Denoise on the main text track because it's less CPU intensive, has low latency, and it's very easy to set up. On the other hand, I would usually place the Spectral Denoise on the 4th track for occasional use. Having said that, I have also tried a Spectral Denoise plugin on the main track, and it does not add any noticeable latency, except when using the adaptive mode. So let's have a look at the Dialog Denoise plugin. This plugin is a multi-band noise gate, so it is a good alternative to traditional noise gates. You can have different thresholds in different parts of the frequency spectrum by moving the nodes on the graphical interface. The higher the threshold, the more noise reduction. So for example, if I open the Remove Hiss preset, you can see a higher threshold in the top frequencies, and if I load the Remove Rumble preset, the opposite happens. I can then offset the threshold curve with the threshold slider and adjust the reduction amount with the reduction slider. There is an intelligent auto mode which will analyze the signal and continuously adjust the threshold for you, and there is also a manual learn mode where you can feed a particular type of noise into the plugin. Dialog Denoise can be used for a variety of purposes and certainly will be very useful in dialogue for film, for example, where there can be loads of background noises like wind and traffic. I usually get good quality speech recordings, however, from recording studios, so I don't use it that much, but I still have found a good use for this plugin. Whenever I get a very clicky reader, I use this plugin to minimize some of the high frequencies present on mouth clicks, so that my traditional noise gate doesn't have to work so hard. Let me show you an example. In this audio, you can hear some clicks between words.
Visible. They flew everywhere together, and that means they were always in the soup together. One day, in their plane, they saw a big gray cloud. Visible. They flew.
If I was using just a noise gate, I'll have to adjust the threshold quite high to about -23 dB to get rid of those clicks.
Visible. They flew everywhere together, and that means they were always in the soup together. One day, in their plane, they saw a big gray cloud. Visible. They flew everywhere together.
But then there is the potential risk of losing some of the actual words elsewhere in the story, as the threshold is quite close to the average speech levels. So one way of dealing with this is by inserting the Dialog Denoise plugin before the noise gate in the FX chain. The idea is to gate only the very high frequencies here, so that the main gate does not have to work so hard. First, I am lowering the threshold to a safer -27 dB on the main gate, which means that you can hear the click again. But then, I am going to load the Remove Hiss preset on the Denoise plugin, and the click will hopefully be gone.
Visible. They flew everywhere together, and that means they were always in the soup together. One day, in their plane, they saw a big gray cloud. Visible. They flew everywhere together, and that means they were always in the soup together. One day, in their plane, they saw a big gray cloud. Visible. They flew everywhere together, and that means they were all.
The Remove Hiss preset is a good starting point, although it's taking too much high-end for my liking. So I am going to adjust some parameters to process the audio as little as possible, but just enough to help the main gate.
Visible. They flew everywhere together, and that means they were always in the soup together. One day, in their plane, they saw a big gray cloud. Visible. They flew everywhere together, and that means they were always in the soup together. One day, in their plane, they saw a big gray cloud, visible. They flew everywhere together, and that means...
So here you have it. I have taken out just enough high frequencies with the Dialog Denoise to allow the main gate to function with a threshold of minus 27.8 dBs, which is over 4 dBs lower than before. Note that the Dialog Denoise plugin on its own is not enough to gate the click. It's the combination of the two plugins that does it. Let's have an on and off comparison.
One day, in their plane, they saw a big gray cloud, visible. They flew everywhere together, and that means they were always in the soup together. One day, in their plane, they saw a big gray cloud, visible. They flew everywhere together, and that means they were always in the soup together. One day, in their plane, they saw a big gray cloud, visible. They flew everywhere together, and that means they were always in the soup together. One day, in their plane, they saw a big gray cloud, visible.
Dialog Denoise can also be used to remove low-frequency noise, so I am going to try the Auto Mode preset to see if I can get rid of the 100 Hz hum.
Mother seemed restless, and every day stood at the bottom of the lane watching and waiting for an hour or so. The children pretended not to notice when she turned and walked slowly back to the cottage with tears in her eyes.
The hum is still there, so I am going to change the threshold curve offset and the reduction amount.
Mother seemed restless, and every day stood at the bottom of the lane watching and waiting for an hour or so. The children pretended not to notice when she turned.
Okay, so it does the job once we adjust some parameters, but it is processing some higher frequencies that don't need to be processed. So I'm going to try the manual mode.
Mother seemed restless, and every day stood at the bottom of the lane watching and waiting for an hour or so. The children pretended not to notice when she turned and walked slowly back to the cottage with tears in her eyes. Mother seemed restless. Mother seemed restless, and every day stood at the bottom of
It does get rid of the hum, but we have to be careful not to process the audio too much, or we will be killing the warmth of the voice. The female voice sounds thinner, but it's not too noticeable. However, if we play a male voice and make an A-B comparison, the lack of low frequencies is quite noticeable.
With the rest of us, Ellie said firmly. The Major turned, an expression of such bitter anger on his face that for a moment Ellie quailed. His left eye started to twitch just then, however, the skin tightening and juddering. Pressing the heel of his hand tightly over it, he got up and limped from the room without another word. It'll do him good.
So in this case, it would be better and safer to use a dedicated plugin like the dehum module or a combination of the two. It's a similar case when using Dialog Denoise to fix low-frequency issues due to the proximity effect. Here I have a selection of words with some plosives and low-frequency rumble.
Disprove it. Ah, she says. Come back to you, she says, with trouble.
I am going to load the Remove Rumble preset, and I am going to adjust the threshold and reduction sliders until the low frequencies have been removed.
Disprove it. Ah, she says. Come back to you, she says, with troubling enthusiasm. Disprove it. Ah, she says. Come back to you, she says, with troubling enthusiasm. Disprove it. Ah, she says. Come back to you, she says, with troubling enthusiasm. Disprove it. Ah, she says. Come back to you, she says, with troubling enthusiasm.
Disprove it.
Ah!
As you can hear, the side effect is that the voice sounds thinner, so to avoid overprocessing the audio, the best thing to do would be to have a combination of plugins like EQ and Dialog Denoise to do part of the job, and then use the Deplosive module, which we will see later, and the spectral editor to manually deal with the more difficult cases. Thanks for watching. In the next part, it will be the turn of the click.